one first. The first thing is going to be talking about a little bit of a history lesson. I know a lot of people have seen some interesting events over the past few weeks, and more events happening today that have been pretty hard to stomach, if especially if this is your first season in crypto. And I think it's important to understand. I've said this many times, and you'll hear this from pretty much every single person who has ever been an employee at, a Y Combinator style company or Coinbase specifically, because Brian loves to talk about this a lot. But it's a really true phrase, which is it's never as good as it seems, but it's also never as bad as it seems. Even when things seem really rough, and everybody is saying this is the end, it's so over. The reality is that like there's always going to be extreme emotions tied into speculative bubbles. And that is what we are in. We are in a speculative bubble, and we've been in one for quite some time. And so one thing I want to like level set with people is to have their expectations in line when they think about this industry in a broader narrative. And more specifically, what we're thinking about and how we think about the nature of what Quilibrium Inc. is going to be playing in the part of writing the stories of that future. And so I want to just draw a couple of parallels real quick. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this over and hope to God it works. Of course it didn't. Okay, so yeah, I've been having some troubles with Streamlabs. Let me get that sorted out. Hey, there we go. Okay, so anyway, I've got Excalidraw open because we're going to have a couple of items that I'm going to draw out as I paint the picture of three different stories from history that inspire me a lot and make me think a lot about what the future of crypto is going to look like. So to start things off, we'll wind the clock back to 1970s. In the 1970s, there was this idea of the homebrew computer. Like people were first starting to learn about computers in like a more personalized context, because before, you had like the ENIAC and these big vacuum tube filled machines, and then the advent of the transistor started to shrink technology down, so these computers were not actually taking up the full size of a room, and eventually like things were getting down to the mini computer. And around the 1970s, technology had gotten to the point where people were actually starting to experiment personally. Like they were starting to build out their own home computers. And there were lots of schematics that were, passed around through these homebrew clubs. And there were also starting to be some consumer-oriented hobbyist computer devices. But at the end of the day, these were all like very nerdy devices. Like you had to have like a breadboard that you hand wrapped and wired yourself, and you had these like very huge books that were like guides on how to actually set this all up, and people just didn't actually really care. Like if you were a normal person that was not a nerd, that you could see these things and you could be like, that's really neat, but that's never going to sit on my desk. Like people are saying this is the future, but I just don't see it. But one thing you have to think about is what came out of that. So during the 1970s, there was one particular homebrew club, the Homebrew Computer Club, very aptly named. And there was a trio of individuals there that ultimately became the founders of Apple Inc. And they introduced a personal computer at the Homebrew Computer Club called the Apple One. And it was pretty janky. I've talked about this in previous streams and actual talks that I've done at like FarCon and a talk I gave at Coinbase. And this device was a very clunky wooden thing, and that was the prototype. But nevertheless, it like changed the narrative a bit, because instead of people having to, manually build these things themselves, it was something instead that people could buy. Like it was a consumer-oriented device, and it was something that really started to challenge the narrative of what a personal computer was and what that actually meant. And so you started to see this change in the industry that companies were slowly working towards and building, where you had what was the previous, industry niche of the mini computer, and IBM being very slow to pick up on that. And then you had the advent of the personal computer, and again, IBM was very slow to pick up on that. But by around the 1980s, the personal computer had started to take off, and people were actually using it for things that was more than just like geeking out. Like people are starting to actually use these for financialized applications. And so as these offshoots started to spring up, you started to see competition occur within these industries because there was suddenly a influx of money that was, accumulating from all the different entrants. And one of the things that was really important to notice is that a lot of engineering went into this because these people were, obviously talented hardware engineers, and they may have worked in other industries that were adjacent to this, but trying to like compress everything down into the most cost economic way for a business to produce it, but still functional means for a consumer to do powerful things that they couldn't do before. Like back in the day, you were doing spreadsheets by hand, and now you can do spreadsheets on a computer that can sit on your desk and you can print that out, and that was very novel. But ultimately, like things started to move beyond just basic finance. But there were some companies that couldn't get past that. That was their bread and butter. They sold to accountants. They sold to business leaders, and that was it. Like that, they thought that that was the depth of computing. And so you didn't really have a whole lot of people who were like teachers or creative artists or anything like that had quite gotten into the realm of using a personal computer. And through the conversations that Steve Jobs and others at Apple had with individuals who are working in those industries, he realized that the personal computer was not personal enough, that there were things that needed to be done that moved beyond finance. And at the time, that was basically received by the industry as a joke. People did not think that that was necessary, that there wouldn't be money in it, that people wouldn't have a computer on every single desk in their home, like that this wasn't going to be something meaningful, but he thought differently. And by consequence, Apple quickly seized the entire market for education, seized the entire market for creative types, and ultimately blossomed into the Apple ecosystem that we know and love today. And I think about this lesson a lot because it's one of those moments in history where people are looking back at things like the early days of crypto, where we are just beginning to eke out this idea of decentralized finance, that we're, challenging the notion of fiat rails, that we're challenging the notion of just the sheer concept of interchange of value. And ultimately, things continue to develop and created new ecosystems. You have these new chains that emerge that start to expand the capabilities and start to create these new ideas and more complexity. And ultimately, what I'm seeing is that exact same pattern play out again. We are seeing the world of crypto focusing just on finance. When you start to see things like people focusing on creators, like they'll talk about the creator economy, what you'll notice when you listen to what they're saying is that when they talk, they are talking about putting creators into a financialized topic, like putting art on chain, putting music on chain, and selling these things as NFTs. They are strictly focused on the financial. They're not focused on the things that artists personally care about. Because yes, to an artist, there is a business side to them, but they are not strictly in the business of art. They are in the passion of art. And it's these types of things that I feel like our industry is just completely glossing over. And it's something that's going to blindside them when there is actually something much more capable and much more adept at handling what it is that these individuals actually want to do to pursue their passions vigorously. And so this is just one of the three aspects of history that I think is playing out in a little bit of repeating. So the way that I think about this is talking about the axis of what you can do and what happens when the world starts to change that idea. The second thing I want to talk about is something that will feel very, unfortunately, at home right now. The video game crash of 1983. So in the 1980s, the video game industry was largely dominated by Atari, Magnavox, and a few others, and what essentially was this idea of like home video game systems that you'd release a new one every couple years. You'd be like pushing out a bunch of video games that were like usually brand deals. Like, there was the most infamous one, of course, was the E.T. video game that was released during the E.T. movie. And that was, those types of games that were coming out were like mass produced, very quickly built, not very great. And by consequence, over time, there was this cycle of people pushing out new consoles, pushing out a bunch of rehashes of the same games with the same rules, with the same ideas. And after a certain point, it was reaching this market saturation level where people did not actually want to buy a new console. They didn't want to buy these games because these games sucked. And by about 1983, which was roughly the peak of the video game industry, They were sitting at about 3.2 billion in total revenue that year for the video game industry, which is quite a bit. That's about $10.2 billion in current dollars. But in roughly 2 years, they completely cratered down to a annual revenue of about 100 million. Why is that? And ultimately what it comes down to is people were being flooded with a bunch of shit that they didn't want. And it's that simple. And so you can, again, there's this parallel that you can start to see where, like right now with the various hype waves that have happened in crypto, you have like the original like ICO hype, the NFT hype, even DeFi Summer had its own unique hype because it certainly propped up a bunch of algo stables that ended up being pieces of shit that wrecked people's lives. And then you have, of course, the current meta of the meme coins, which is starting to, again, reach that market saturation where people are realizing, this is shit. I am just gambling. Why am I doing this? And so we're starting to see like this, financial rejection in play. Obviously, there are broader market consequences that are happening right now, and people will have all sorts of theories about, how it's the tariffs that are doing this, or it's some other like longer economic story like a recession that's been impending for a while that's playing out. But in reality, we are actually seeing that same kind of crash, that same video game crash that happened in the 1980s. And so what I want to talk about with that story is what went wrong and what got fixed. What led to the video game era that we know as today, because like most people, we've played video games and we don't really think about the infamous Atari landfill because that's such a transient moment of history. Like it's not something that was the cornerstone, that was the end. Like we just remember the Atari landfill and gaming was gone. Of course gaming's not gone. And so what happened? Essentially, these analysts were basically, they were dooming Atari, they were dooming Magnavox because obviously they were in, bad financial state. And they were saying that this is the end of home gaming industry because in the 1980s as well, home computers were starting to rise. And so they were blaming home computers and the poor quality of games, of course, as the reason why the game industry was over. And what's interesting about that is that by 1985, there was this small, I wouldn't say small, but there was this relatively unknown game company, unless you were like frequenting the arcades, that made mostly playing cards in these arcade games, and that was their entire business. And they were based out of Japan, and they re-envisioned how to approach the gaming industry. And what they thought was, we need to think about how American consumers currently see this industry. And they see it basically as them getting screwed, like they're getting ripped off, like they're not getting a good entertainment experience. And so what they did is they set up a quality bar where you had to, as a game publisher, you had to meet this quality bar before they would license your game to run on their console. Because what was happening with Atari is anybody was just hucking games and there was no quality bar at all. And so ultimately, Nintendo released the what was the Famicom in Japan as the Nintendo Entertainment System in the US. And they stylized it like a VCR so that people would more associate the common elements of home entertainment systems for like watching movies and things that they already had like strong quality experiences wrapped around. But instead with video games. And so they had the Nintendo Seal of Quality, which was their quality check and gate that prevented crappy games from ending up, being distributed and destroying the industry. And of course, history was made with that. The NES is a cornerstone of video game history. Nobody has like seriously bad things to say about that moment in time, except maybe having to blow into the cart too many times because the game didn't want to start. But outside of that, like it was a watershed moment for the industry. It changed how things were done. And so I want to talk about this in the lens of what's happening in crypto in the sense that we are seeing that same failure. We're seeing the quality failure of both things like the memes, like not just meme coins, but like the mimetic tendency for people to jump on hype trains of like completely unchecked assumptions or completely lack thereof of assumptions, like this financial degeneracy. There's just no quality gate on these things that's resulting in people making very poor financial decisions. And ultimately, like it's burning people and it's making people feel like crypto is a scam and that there's nothing good in it. And that comes entirely from the fact that we have a lack of quality enforcement. So I wanted to talk about that because this was the problem that Nintendo solved that was unique and what positioned them to be so different. The final thing that I want to talk about as a story of history repeating was the dot-com bubble. So in the 1990s, there was a cadre of early internet companies. A lot of people saw the early days of the internet as this unique idea that let people exchange information in ways that were much more personal than, you know, having to call somebody and that's all you get. Maybe a group phone call, but that's expensive. And so like it was connecting people in unique and interesting ways. And it was also introducing multimedia to people in ways that previously it was very much a non-interactive model. You would watch TV and there would be big producers of television programs. But instead, this became something that was more interactive. And so there were early companies that were starting to jump on top of this. Now, of course, at the time, we didn't have significant bandwidth, so there wasn't, you couldn't do live chats over video. You couldn't have streams like Twitch. Like, these things were not yet viable because the technology was lacking at the time. But nevertheless, the dreamers and the idealists of this created these very large companies. You'd find them in the field of search engines like Google kicking things off, Alta Vista, Yahoo, of course. You had these e-commerce companies that started to differentiate into small silos like pets.com very, very infamously. And then you had even online delivery services. The very first case of online delivery, if you want to call it that, was actually like Pizza Hut had opened up a online portal where one specific Pizza Hut was running a server that would take these requests in and then they would just basically send it out to all of the different Pizza Hut branches across the country. And that was how they kind of like kick-started the whole idea of online delivery of food. And then there was also actual online delivery of restaurants that was attempted in the late 1990s. Very few people remember it because it wasn't successful. And then there was also, of course, the internet service providers. Like you had your CompuServe, you had Prodigy, you had America Online or AOL. And then you started to see this shift. Early 2000, around March or so. There were so many of these companies that had propped up these IPOs and they were, after it all. They were trying to dominate the market under whatever it was that they were trying to do. And realistically, they didn't have business plans that panned out under the current state of the technology that existed at the time, the progress and trajectory that technology was able to make during that time. And of course, you had a broader economic conditions that were starting to push down on things. And so by consequence, you had what was the dot-com bubble bursting. And there were a few companies that had just started shortly before then. And oftentimes they were in some of those domains that were ending up largely producing a bunch of failures of companies. So you had Yahoo and Google, you had Amazon and eBay. And besides AOL, you had like this cadre of small internet companies that were starting to get into more niche services like high-speed broadband, because at the time that wasn't niche, it was expensive. And they were laying down the groundwork of things that they knew were going to take a long time to achieve. And the market, of course, punished them significantly, but they made the right decisions to ensure that they were in it for the long haul, that they were making generational decisions that they'd be able to capture or capitalize on in the years to come when everybody else was making these short-term decisions that were just not feasible for a business. And so, as a consequence, after the dot-com bubble bursted and all of these other companies had died out, you then had basically Amazon, eBay, PayPal, of course, from the eBay generation. You had a few different ISPs, and you had, of course, Google and Yahoo that were basically dominating the industry and becoming titans. And so this is what I'm basically seeing, again, to draw a parallel in crypto today. Unlike the other two categories where it's the difference of what you can do or a quality enforcement bar, in this case, it's a planning for long term, like planning for the long-term generations of what technology is going to be able to enable. And so these are the three pillars that I think of historically as playing out in crypto all at the same time. And there's a lot of overlap, of course, in how these stories played out and the ideas that formed around them. But I think it's important to think about these because these parallels are how we are defining what we're doing as a company and what we're doing for the protocol in order to ensure its long-term success. And so what I think about in terms of like what you can do in the context of what can we enable, we think less about finance. Finance is a part of it, but finance is just an application. More about what other people need, what other industries need. And we think about, I don't know why it's auto-completing there, that's super annoying. We think about what type of creative works can be enabled. Because when you talk about the problems that technology solves, when you're trying to design something, if you're designing something just simply for the sake of trying to basically create a solution in search of a problem, which is something that typically gets flung at the crypto crowd, and it's because what people are solving is something that is novel. Like, it needs to be something novel or else nobody's going to use it. And so what crypto actually uniquely solves in applying those properties of what crypto uniquely solves is something very valuable. So what I said with the creatives, for example, like in the industry that Apple tackled with education and creators, what was missing was the tools they needed in order to acclimate to the digital world. So they didn't have quite the easy tools to develop digital art. And so Apple was pushing into that audience, getting more tools built in that ecosystem to support those artists to do those things. And so from our standpoint and what we think about what creators are having problems with today, this is where we get into some topics that are pretty contentious, but the topic of the way that AI art has damaged artists in the sense that these models are basically being trained on artists' content that's been posted in like public websites and stuff. And these artists aren't being compensated for this training data. And then the art that gets produced by these machine learning models is something that is so derivative, but like so derivative of such a mass of different things that you can't uniquely link it to the original creators of those art pieces. And so by consequence, they also get no attribution. They get no reward, they get no attribution, and they didn't get to actually have any say in whether that data is being used to train. And so this is something that I focus on in the way that we're trying to promote Quilibrium's use and adoption, because one of the unique attributes of crypto in general is being able to have attributable ownership of data, that idea that you own your data and you control your data, but more specifically with a privacy-preserving protocol that you control who sees your data and who can have access to your data, and then compounding it a step further with the ability for decentralized compute to be able to perform things like machine learning on top of that data, that you, as an individual who's an artist, being able to contribute that into the training models, that the tagged data that associates it to you flows all the way through, such that when inference is run on that model, it attributes the ownership of the original data that was used for the production of that particular image, or that particular written work, or that particular song, that it flows back to the original creators, so that when that inference is run and is paid for, that the people involved as creators are getting a split. And so that is one of the most important things to think about when we're talking about what we're trying to do. What is unique? What is it that we are trying to accomplish that broadly others have not thought about? And it really comes down to the ability to combine, the ability to compose these like other broad concepts that are emerging in the industry, and do so in ways that are unique and novel and actually solve people's problems. I guess I wouldn't call it payments, it would be more like royalties. And then regarding the quality enforcement side of things, some people have seen some of the early days of Quilibrium where we were building a lot more in public. We still build in public. That is something that I try very strongly to continue doing. But the way we build in public is much more about what is like the active right now, whatever the pressing moment is that people are more broadly aware of. I found that when I try to build more broadly in public and start to show early designs and early projects that aren't ready for public release, people tend to get very upset because these things, of course, take time. And as I've said many times, crypto is a very now state at the moment. And so one of the things that I had shown early on was our Q console, which is basically our answer to Amazon Web Services AWS console. And one of the things that if people paid close enough attention to what we are introducing that's rather unique, like, of course, we are introducing a encrypted end-to-end version of S3. We are adding a multi-party computation version of key management service. We are basically leveraging all the unique qualities of Quilibrium's network to provide incredible value adds to those services that we're going to be exposing through the console. But one of the things that people haven't quite picked up on, and it's probably because I haven't talked about it to a significant enough degree, I haven't pointed at it, but if you were observant enough, you would have noticed there is a social component. And that social component is actually really important because decentralization is freedom. Decentralization enables people to do things permissionlessly. And as a consequence of that permissionless nature, we have seen this industry under repeated assault through crappy scams, crappy NFT projects, crappy ICOs, crappy meme coins. And as a consequence of that, the industry has been harmed in ways that almost feel irreparable. Now, again, we are creating a decentralized protocol. So we can't just fulfill the Nintendo seal of quality. We can't just, control what is being launched on this network. It is a permissionless protocol. So this has a lot of something that you have to kind of feed back into the design of things like QConsole, and it comes back to the question of how do you add quality bar to a protocol that enables people to create whatever they want? And the answer is it's through exposure. And so the nature of what we're doing with QConsole is a decentralized application that you can manage your services in the same way that you manage things on AWS. But we are exposing elements that people can use and adopt. For example, let's say I made a front end for managing a decentralized exchange. And I wanted to share that front end so that people could make remixes of it, that people could plug it in as a small component. Like if I'm building a website that has a token of its own and I want people to be able to use that token, but this token's relatively new and people don't have it, I could take that DEX component, plug it into my own application, expose that as a simple component so people can make the swap into the token that they need in order to continue their action and carry on. That type of composability is something that AWS as a console does not expose. They don't have this idea of people sharing things. But what's unique about that is that because there is an easy path for people to share their applications or application components in a way that developers can adopt other people's works, there's a quality bar issue. And so by consequence, the nature of how we are generating that social component of the Q console is going to essentially be through user adoption, user voting, and user engagement around these ideas. And so essentially, we are using that as a way to decentralize that Nintendo seal of quality component to help ensure that the quality bar of the things that people are using is consistently raised higher and higher. And that social consensus is something that hasn't really been captured very well for anything yet other than actual social media. And I think that that's a unique dynamic that people haven't really come to terms with yet because there hasn't really been anything else that's done that yet. And so I think that that's going to be one of those surprising moments that is going to, people will look back on and say, this is what was unique. This is what actually made a difference in changing the way that this industry functioned for the long haul. And speaking of the long haul, the way that we're thinking about things in terms of overcoming, the bubble that's potentially actively bursting right now as we speak, is the way in which we actually design the tokenomics of the protocol. And so one of the things that people have seen as history's played out of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others is that in order to have sustainable tokenomics, there has to be something that thinks more in terms of the longer generation by generation approach. And so the way that we incorporate generations into the actual consensus algorithm's reward output itself is literally by measuring the computational speed of the network. Now, there's been a few other projects that have basically leveraged some sort of supply-demand dynamic, and we're not quite doing that in the same way. We do have a dynamic fee market for the nature in which like transactions will cost at certain points, so that if there's a hot interval that's like causing a lot of friction for getting traffic to flow through successfully, obviously the fees would rise in order to address the congestion. But that's not particularly unique or novel. But what is particularly unique or novel is instead of having something that is essentially like this, depending on the protocol, they do like a 10 or 20 or 50-year horizon where the token issuance flattens out if it's like a proof of work scheme, or that there is a economic policy of a over titrating percentage over time that eventually goes to 0% issuance, and then there's just transaction fees or something as part of the nature of the protocol. Instead of doing that, we've actually taken this notion of hybridizing this proof of work system where you do have tapering issuance because there is natural stages in which the market reaches saturation. And you can see that happening in practically every industry over the course of about 10 years, over and over and over again. And instead of like simply succumbing to those patterns and designing a short-term thing that will rapidly hype up, it doesn't matter that it tapers off because we're just in it for a short term. Instead, we're thinking about it for the long term, that every single one of those 10-year cycles, we want to actually capture the new generation of technology that has emerged, incentivize its adoption and use, and then also give people a new opportunity as newcomers to participate meaningfully in the protocol in ways that is very hard to do when you get into the later stages. For example, on Bitcoin, you do not have people running new miners today who have not been in the mining space to any significant degree. You'll have a few hobbyists that try this. You'll have a few people who will buy one of those mining rigs and they'll try it, but you don't actually have like large masses of people who are suddenly deciding, I'm going to become a Bitcoin miner, because realistically the competition bar is way too high. And so mining pools have basically consolidated into a handful of like maybe three to six individual organizations, and they control the majority of the hash rate of the network. And so that's very harmful to the economic security of the network. And so very similarly with Ethereum, there is the same problem with the nature of how much capital has converged on people who are willing to put forth the effort to do validation. And so by consequence, you have Lido and Coinbase essentially being over 50% of all staked ETH. And you can make arguments that like these are good stewards of the protocol, like they have no interest in engaging in malicious ways, but that's not important. What's important is that if the protocol is intended to be decentralized, then your goal is to get as many people to actively participate in the decentralization of that protocol and not converge onto a handful of a small set of individuals. And so this is something that we're even seeing right now in our own 2.0 release, where the nature of how the mining algorithm currently works is something that's producing a lot of convergence, that there's just, it's getting into a smaller number of individual nodes that are participating. And that is not ideal. That is not something that is healthy. And that is why we are pushing so hard and so fast to get to one where the proof of meaningful work algorithm works in a completely different way, that things are more sharded out, that it is much harder for miner centralization to be a pressure of the network. And that comes back full circle to the nature of how we are planning for the long term of the network. And so these are the kinds of things that I want people to think about. Like when you look at how history repeats, there is this nature of people to just like not consider how those things happened and apply them to how things are currently happening, because they'll just argue that this is too new, this is too unique, that this won't happen again in the same way, and yet we just find ourselves making the same mistakes and making the same decisions, and same outcomes ultimately emerge. And so that's what's playing out today, and this is how we think about the nature of how this company is meant to operate, how this protocol is intended to be built, and how we intend to solve some of the most severe harms that have happened to this industry. That was a pretty long ramble, but I hope that helps, and I'll go ahead and put in that last element. I don't know if people are going to take screenshots of this, but I did want to at least have it zoomed in so people could kind of like get an idea of how we talk about the stories of how history repeats itself and how that applies to Q.